This is the Connected Baby podcast series, sponsored by you, the listener. If you'd like to help spread the message of the science of connection even further, then you can make a donation at connectedbaby.net/donate.
Welcome to the Connected Baby podcast, where we explore how people are putting the science of connection to use in their lives.
Now, throughout this podcast, we'll be referring to a young child, and for his privacy, we've disguised the name for obvious reasons, but hopefully that won't allow you to lose thread of the story. Hello and welcome to our weekly Connected Baby podcast with Dr. Suzanne Zeedijk. I'm Gary Robinson. Our special guest on the other end of the phone is Jenn Nassen. Jen is the head teacher of Pitteuchar East Primary School in Fife, Scotland. And Jen, you've got a great story to tell us. First of all, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate it.
Hi, Jen. I'm so excited you're here.
Hi, Suzanne. Lovely to talk to you again.
Now, we appreciate it's the afternoon here at time of recording, but people could be listening to this at anywhere in the world.
So in the whole world.
So wherever you are listening to this, good morning, good evening, middle of the night, whatever it is. But Jen, you're a head teacher at Pitteuchar East Primary School in Fife in Scotland. And I know that you've worked closely with Suzanne, and we'll talk about that relationship in just a moment. But tell me about your school. Tell me about this school in Fife. What's the best thing about it?
Oh gosh, there's so many good things about it. I would have to say that the best thing about it is the children. That's what motivates us. I am watching them learn and watching them develop from nursery right through to primary 7. And the relationships that we have with the children and their families, that's a real strength here.
See, as soon as you asked Jen, she started with the word relationships. That's really fab.
But that's absolutely true. And that was one of the jobs that I had to take on at first, was really building relationships with people because they didn't know me. And you come in as a head teacher and they have perceptions of that.
And when you say everybody, you're talking everybody from the children to the parents to your colleagues to fellow teachers?
Absolutely. I knew some of my head teacher colleagues in this area. I knew the school itself very well in terms of a building because I attended here as a pupil myself.
Oh.
And my mum taught here, which actually put me off initially. That was what held me back when I was asked to take on the acting post here, but decided that no, I would do it in spite of previous relationships, which I have to say had always been good. I had a good experience here as a child, and my mum loved teaching here and really loved her colleagues. But obviously coming in as a head teacher is a very different role.
So you're here to tell us today about how you became aware of connection and actually the story of how you and your staff transformed the school simply by changing the language you used in relation to the children's behaviour. I suppose that's it in a little bit of a nutshell, but you can obviously expand on that. How did that come about, and what prompted that decision and that change?
It were two critical moments which happened very close together. The first was actually hearing Suzanne speak at a head teachers conference, and as a cluster we were so impressed with, a cluster is a family of schools which all feed into one high school, and our cluster decided that we wanted to invest and to get Suzanne out to speak to all our teachers and support staff. And she did that. And at one point she referred to distressed behaviour. And I thought, never heard, that's interesting. And it must have been filed. It was filed somewhere in the back of my mind. And then we had a child, and that was when I really thought, what kind of language are we using here? I looked after a child, was having a real crisis. And the word came, you need to come, is kicking off. He's really off on one, is having a meltdown. Now, that really told me nothing. I walked into this situation, I didn't know what to expect, other than would be very upset. And that was when it really struck me that this child was going through such a dreadful time in his personal life that, yes, we were getting a high level of verbal abuse from this child, but it wasn't really directed at us at all. People used to talk, we used to talk about bad behaviour, and then that changed into challenging behaviour, but the word challenge also brought a responsibility with it to teachers, and to head to management. If a child has been challenging, who's going to meet that challenge and who's going to solve that problem and take that problem away so that it never happens again? And that's impossible.
And it's quite confrontational language as well, isn't it?
It is, yeah, absolutely. And I leant down beside was leaning against the wall with his forearms up over his face. And I'd actually said to him that I don't know how to help you. And he slid down the wall and he just put his head on his knees and he said, nobody can help me. Mm-hmm. And at that point I thought, we have to help. And it's a distress, it's real distress that we're seeing here. And that was a trigger point for me, and I began to look at other language that we use. And we didn't, I have to make it clear, we didn't just decide, unilaterally as a school that we were going to change the way we talked. As a management team, we discussed this and decided that we had to lead by example. And people very quickly followed suit.
And had you had the talk by Suzanne, and Suzanne referred to distress behaviour, and then you were privy to behaviour. So that was the. And
the two things acted as a catalyst. And
right.
My colleague actually said, my deputy was standing next to me at the time, and we were both by this stage. Myself and Susan and was kind of crouched down, because if a child goes down, the last thing, the body language of an adult standing, towering above them is really intimidating. So we automatically kind of got down to where he was. And Susan had said to me, if an adult displayed that level of distress, there would be immediate help for them. And there's just not for children in that. And I'd said to Susan, and I said, no, we're it. That is what we are. We're these children's lifeline. And when you start thinking about it like that, the responsibility is huge, but the privilege in that is it matches the responsibility.
Had there been a build-up to this?
Oh, yes.
This quote-unquote meltdown by young that had been noticed by the staff, and what was the?
No, we knew that his placement was breaking down.
Right.
But he hadn't shared that with us, and we didn't. We had to respect that. So we knew that things weren't good for him, and it all sparked off that day with a perceived insult from another child that took completely the wrong way. It was a tiny, tiny trigger that day, but we'd been watching him really closely and trying to do what we could, because we realised we were dealing with a powder keg.
The thing that's amazing for me about Jen's story, Jen, is that it's reflected in this whole interview. It's about the power of language, either to help or to hinder. Mm-hmm. So all Pitteuchar East Primary School ended up doing was changing their language. It didn't cost anything.
Nope.
You didn't have to get in experts.
No, we didn't.
You didn't have to have a plan. All they did was change one simple phrase from challenging behaviour to distressed behaviour. And it transformed the school.
Yep, that's helped quite a number of colleagues over the years. Recently to last session, there was a child who could become very defiant and appeared to be calling the shots. And because we refer to it as distressed behaviours, his teacher was actually more able to empathise and more able to cope than if it had just been labelled as challenging behaviour, because the expectation is somebody's going to meet that challenge, and that's usually a teacher or an adult.
And in fact, once you start to tune into this thing about language, which is part of the Connected Baby's aim, but here's a school that has put that awareness into action, you start to listen to everything. So just listen to the words we're using here. He was defiant as opposed to distressed. We have a looked after child. The children in our looked after system, 80% of men in prison for violent crimes in Scotland were looked after children. But that means that somebody wasn't able to look after them very well, or they wouldn't have ended up committing the violence that put them into prison. So we can start to look at the way in which language shapes what we think reality is, and actually the reality can be very different. And we create our own realities through our language. And that's
Absolutely. And we create our own behaviours. The language becomes embedded. It becomes the way we think about things. It's no longer a conscious decision. And when you get into that mindset, you realise that most of the challenging behaviours that we used to describe, they're motivated by fear. They're motivated by fear of failure, fear of falling out with your friends. You know, if you drill down almost on every confrontational episode, it's driven by fear. One of the participants is motivated by fear.
And in fact, if we go back to the story, his placement was breaking down. What that means is was confronting terrible loss, rejection, and failure. He was about to get chucked out of his current family. We call a foster family a placement. The science of connection tells us that a child that's facing loss, rejection, and fear will get overwhelmed. That's what he was overwhelmed with loss and fear.
And actually what he almost did was fall into a pattern which I've seen in, I've had many looked after children that I've dealt with over and been the named person for over the years, and very, very often when a child is having to move one placement to another, they will systematically break down numerous relationships on their terms, because that's then easier for them to deal with.
I was at a training last week where a 5-year-old came up in the conversation, and they'd had 6 placements. What's your brain like if you're 5 and you've lived in 6 different worlds? Your brain's really confused and full of terror. Now make that child be a bit older to age. It's not surprising that would get overwhelmed, and lots of looked after children would get overwhelmed, and then they exhibit challenging behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. I've dealt with children, more than one child, who have come to school with their pyjamas in their school bag, or a teddy bear in their bag, because they're not convinced they're going to go back to the same place that night.
So they've packed their pyjamas themselves?
Yeah, they've sneaked them out of the house.
Wow.
Jen,
because they don't know what they're going back to.
Jen, you can't see Gary's look of surprise. And one of the things I love about this podcast series is it mixes up all of these stories from all different sectors of life and makes us think there are children going to school who've packed their pajamas because they don't know where they're going home to. Of course they're distressed. We need to honour...
And we expect them to learn and conform while they're here. And you know what the miracle is that they do.
We are unkind.
Got the right adults.
We didn't mean to be unkind, but we are unkind to those children.
Yeah.
Jen, was it? Did you have a hard? Did you have a hard sell changing this language to the staff?
No.
So did they take it on board straight away?
We didn't discuss it with staff.
All right. Okay.
That sounds really, that's not normally the way I manage things, but we didn't actually we just found we were speaking about it in a different way. We'd realised it was different. We were, as a management team, were speaking about it in a different way. We had, the staff here, the team here are wonderful, at restorative approaches. They live and breathe it, and that was very obvious when I arrived, that was an established culture here, that people were given the chance to explain, everybody's point of view was listened to, emotions were discussed. They are nurturing, by nature they are a nurturing staff. And we just changed the language that we were using and found that it was helping an awful lot more people.
And how's the community around the school been affected or gone with the changes? What have you seen change within the community that surrounds the school?
Well, in the school community itself, children are aware that they are treated very, very fairly, and we always ask, was that okay for you? Do you feel that your views were listened to? Are you happy with the way this has, that we're happy with the outcome? And sometimes they'll say no, because they're confident we people. And if they say no, they'll say, right, well, tell us what we could do better next time. So that's kind of expected. That's part of the language that we use now. One of the things that we changed, and I can take no credit for this, it was my previous deputy, Fiona, who has since moved on to a new school. She spoke to the children about love, and I'd never done that. She'd said to, we were dealing with a child who had hurt another child, and we were sort of saying to them, how do you feel? And Fiona suddenly said to this child, we love you all. We really do love you, and we want the best for you. And I was kind of taken aback, and I thought, whoa, that's maybe going a bit too far out of some people's comfort zones to actually be saying to a child, okay, look, we do love you. And I spoke with her afterwards, and I said, I'd never thought about that. Never thought about using that word, And she just kind of shrugged and laughed. She said, well, it's how I feel about them. And I thought, it's how we all feel about them, but we never tell them that.
It would make some people within your profession and other associated professions very, very nervous, to use that word.
But Gary, it also makes many parents nervous because, in fact, I heard a story just last week about a big falling out that two people had because a parent had said, how dare a teacher say that she loved my child? It's not her job to love my child. It's her job to teach my child. It's my job to love my child. And so once again, you get a sense of how risky this idea of changing language is. What Jen has done is simply change language. And that has changed realities and made a lot of people nervous. And actually,
it's taking people out of their comfort zone, but it's working for our children.
Have you had any negative feedback from the parents, Jen, or any at all?
What I found, no, because this hasn't been a public thing.
Right.
This hasn't been a public. We are changing our language. Look at how clever we are. Look at how perceptive we are. We've not done it like that, Gary. We've just changed what we do. And when other parents are talking about, they will come and complain about another child's bad behaviour. So-and-so did this, and it doesn't happen very often here. I have to say the children are generally exceptionally well behaved. But if you start talking about, yes, we are seeing sort of distressed behaviours, and we're doing our very best to deal with that. Parents see it differently as well. Because ultimately, most adults are distressed themselves at the idea of a child being distressed. Your instinct is to help that child.
And I love that you can do that just through language. And that's the power of the story of your school, Jen, that you're showing how powerful language is. And in fact, as you're telling the story, I'm struck that this is also a story of leadership, that you've done what Gandhi encouraged all of us to do. He said, be the change you wish to see in the world. And you just did that. You changed your language. You didn't convince anybody. You didn't have a plan. You just did it. And look what happened. People followed. Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah. But it's helped people. That's what I was saying. If we're talking to, you're talking to a teacher about a child who is challenging the routine in their class, possibly. And you talk, you speak about challenging behaviour. Then I keep going back to this. The expectation is that somebody's going to meet that challenge. And if somebody says the word challenge to you, that actually creates an emotive response. You think, well, who's being challenged? Why am I being challenged? What exactly is being challenged? Am I a victim of this challenge? Is this a contest? Or if somebody says, this is going to be, there'll be challenging times ahead, that's a euphemism for something else.
Do you know what, Jen? If you ever need a reference, get hold of Suzanne, because being compared to Gandhi is probably a once in a lifetime gig, really.
But you know what? Gandhi would have agreed with me because he didn't see himself as special. He was trying to say all of us can do this. And Jen and Pitteuchar East Primary School are an example of exactly what he was saying. All of us.
It helped, though. I have to interject here. It helped that I have a very empathetic team. That's perhaps not the case in every establishment.
That's true.
And what about the academic situation, Jen? I'm sure that you had a superb track record as a primary school when it comes to that area anyway. But has there been an improvement in sort of the academic outputs, if that's the right phrase to use, in terms of the school because of this change of language and hence change of behaviour?
What it has, I think it's still too early to see long term. Yes, we've had statistical, there was a big increase last year and it's gone down a little bit this year, and overall it's on the rise. But what I am seeing is that, the children are highly engaged. Now, when I talk about distressed behaviour, I'm talking about the high level, that it's not the low level frequent interruptions or misbehaviours or whatever you want to call them. I'm talking about children who are on that kind of upper strata of worry. As far as I go as a head teacher, children whose names crop up far too often, who stand out because they don't behave as we would expect a child to behave. And I tell you, I wish I had known now. I wish I knew then what I know now, or what I've begun to understand, because this insight would have affected the way I dealt with numerous other children, particularly in my previous post, where we did have a high number of looked after and distressed children.
Wow.
You know what, Jen, we're coming to the end of this podcast. However, I have a leaflet here in which you've been immortalised.
I think I've seen that leaflet.
Stories of Connection, exhibition and event series, 18th September through to 10th of October at the Scottish Storytelling Centre. You're giving a public lecture on the 22nd of September. That's about your journey that you've just spoken about?
It's about my journey, yes. And in order to make it meaningful, I've drawn several examples. Some children whom I'm currently working with, and others that I worked with in my previous post where I didn't have that level of understanding.
So wow, Jen, is that how you're going to do it? That's amazing.
I had to do that to make it make sense to people, because it's been a long journey. I've been a head teacher now for 8 years, and before that was a deputy for 9 years. I've had a long time in management, and if I had known back then what I now know, I look back on incidents and think, oh my goodness, no wonder that child didn't do what I asked them to.
And this is the first time you've spoken publicly like this about what happened in the school, isn't it?
Yes, I've spoken on restorative approaches before, and mindsets and Carol Dweck's mindsets and things like that. I have spoken about those, but this is the first time that I'm sharing this learning.
Well, we appreciate that very, very much. Just one last thing. There'll be lots and lots of people from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of professions listening to this podcast. Maybe for the first time, maybe on a weekly basis. We're hoping on a weekly basis, but maybe for the first time. And I'd put money on this, that there's quite a few people in the education sector listening. To teachers in particular, what would you say to them? Based on your experience, what wee nugget of wisdom from Jen could you give them?
Right, easy. Just let them know that you believe in them. That's it. That's what is the core of what we do. And I think most teachers and most people in any caring profession, that's almost, even though they don't know it, that will be their mantra. Let them know that you believe in them.
And I love that there's a scientific basis for why that works, and that's the science of connection.
Exactly.
Jen,
It's
it's been
all falling into place.
indeed. Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure, and for me, as always, these sessions are enlightening. All the best for your public lecture in Edinburgh
Thank you
on
very
the
much.
22nd, and no doubt we'll be revisiting what's happening at your particular school, and how you can share what's happening to other schools, not just in Scotland, throughout the UK, but hopefully throughout the world as well.
Thank you, Jen, and to the staff at Pitteuchar East and to Fife Council, who has supported you in doing this.
Thank you very much indeed for that. I will pass that on.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thanks.
This was a GRC production for Connected Baby.